Chapter 1. Callum wrenched open the rear doors. The smell hit him before his eyes could adjust to the interior. Sharp ammonia mixed with sweat and something else, something floral that probably came from soap or cheap perfume but had gone sour in the heat. He stepped back half a pace, keeping his face neutral, and waited for the shapes inside to resolve into people. They filled the cargo space in rows, pressed shoulder to shoulder on the floor. Young women, most of them. Girls, really. Some still had that softness in their faces that hadn't quite hardened into the blankness the facilities cultivated. A few looked up at him. Most kept their eyes down or fixed on the middle distance. "Out," Callum said. "Single file. Don't bunch up." They moved slowly, stiff from the journey. He watched them emerge into the grey morning light of the facility courtyard, blinking against the overcast sky as if it was high noon. His clipboard at the ready, he started the count as they shuffled past him towards the intake door where another contractor waited with a scanner. When the last one cleared the threshold, the contractor barked an order and redirected them to the wall. The van emptied. 29 stood in a ragged line against the concrete, waiting for whatever came next. Callum glanced back into the empty cargo space. Nothing left but a few plastic bottles rolling in the corner and dark patches on the floor he chose not to examine closely. He flipped to the manifest. 30 names listed. 30 pickup confirmations from the processing hub. He ran his finger down the column, then counted the figures against the wall again, slower this time, making sure his eyes weren't playing tricks. 29. The guard approached from the intake door, boots scraping on the pavement. He was new, or at least newer than most. Still had that eager edge that hadn't been worn down yet. Everything there. Callum looked at the manifest one more time. The numbers sat there, black ink on yellow paper. 30. 29 meant questions. 29 meant paperwork, calls back to the hub, maybe a search of the route, maybe an investigation into whether he'd missed something or worse, whether something had happened during transport. 29 meant his afternoon shot, his evening delayed, his week complicated. He thought about the locks on the van doors. Both had been secure when he'd arrived. He thought about the route he'd driven, the stops he'd made, fuel only, no breaks, no diversions. He thought about the smell in the cargo space and the dark patches on the floor. "Yeah," he said. He clicked his pen and signed at the bottom of the manifest. All accounted for. The guard took the clipboard, scanned the signature without really reading it, and handed back the yellow copy. "Right then. You're clear to go." Callum folded the paper into his jacket pocket and walked back to the van. He closed the rear doors, checked the locks, and climbed into the driver's seat in the cab. The air inside smelled like coffee and diesel. Clean. Normal. He started the engine and pulled out of the courtyard, eyes on the road ahead. The facility shrank in his mirrors, grey walls dissolving into grey sky. He had 3 more runs today. Better to keep moving. Better to keep things simple. Anything for a quiet life. The front door attempted its usual resistance against the warped frame as Callum pushed through into the narrow hallway. The smell of frying onions and something tomato-based reached him, warm and ordinary enough to loosen the tension he had carried in his shoulders since morning. He hung his jacket on the hook and kicked off his boots, lining them up against the skirting board out of habit. "You're late." Elaine appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a tea towel. Her hair was pulled back messily. Tired lines framed her eyes. "Extra run, love," Callum said. He moved past her into the kitchen where Owen sat at the table, hunched over his tablet, a packet of crisps open beside him. His son barely glanced up. "Mum threw up again," Owen said, still scrolling. "All over the bathroom floor this morning. Made me late for school because she was hogging the bathroom." Callum stopped and looked at Elaine, who had turned back to the stove. She stirred something in a pan with more energy than it needed. "That's twice this week," Owen continued. "She's probably got that flu everyone's been passing around. Should stay away from the cooker if she's contaminated." "Finish your homework," Elaine said without turning around. Owen shrugged, picked up his tablet, and wandered out of the kitchen with the crisps tucked under his arm. Callum could hear him stamping his feet down on each stair, followed by the slam of his bedroom door. He moved to the sink and filled a glass with water, watching Elaine over the rim as he drank. She kept her back to him, shoulders drawn tight beneath her cardigan. A sudden twinge of panic made him ask, "Viroflux?" Elaine flinched. "Oh, God, no, no." Although already certain he knew what was going on, he was still conscious of an overwhelming relief. "Okay," he said. "Flu. Something like that." He put the glass down on the counter, more forcefully than he'd intended. Elaine did not turn around to face him, so he walked around the table until he stood beside her, close enough to see the faint tremor in her hand as she stirred the sauce. "How long?" he asked quietly. "I don't know what you mean." "Elaine." She stopped stirring, the spoon suspended in the sauce, dripping slowly back into the pan. "Elaine," he said again. And finally she looked at him. Her face was pale, and there was something raw in her expression that made his chest tighten. "A month," she said. "Maybe 6 weeks." He stepped back. Now his suspicion was confirmed. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in. He thought about the facility courtyard, the line of women against the concrete wall, the manifest in his pocket with one name too many. He thought about the locks on the van doors and the numbers that did not match. "He can't know," Rachel said. Her voice was steady now, firm in a way that told him she had been rehearsing this. "Owen can't know. No one can." Callum looked at the ceiling, at the muffled sound of music filtering down from upstairs. 16 years old. Old enough to understand what it meant if anyone found out. Old enough to repeat things he should not. "We'll figure it out," he said, though he had no idea how. Elaine nodded and turned back to the stove. The sauce bubbled quietly. "Dinner will be ready soon," she said. Callum woke before the alarm, as he always did, and lay in the darkness listening to Elaine's breathing beside him. It was steady now, deep and even, but he had heard her earlier in the night, the careful way she had slipped out of bed, the muffled sounds from the bathroom that she tried to keep quiet, the long minutes before she returned. She had not mentioned it and neither had he, and the silence between them on the subject had grown into something solid and immovable. He eased himself out of bed and dressed in the clothes he had laid out the night before, moving through the familiar routine without turning on the light. Downstairs, he made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the street lamps flicker off as dawn approached. The houses opposite were identical to his own, narrow brick terraces with small front gardens and bins lined up along the pavement. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Exactly what they needed to be. His phone buzzed on the counter. 3 pickups today, all from the same processing hub, all going to different facilities. Standard runs. He pocketed the phone and finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, and left it on the draining board. By the time he collected his jacket and keys, the house was still silent behind him. The first 2 runs went smoothly. He had learned a long time ago not to look too closely at the cargo manifests, not to read the names or the notes about where they had come from. It was easier that way, cleaner, and it let him focus on the practical details that mattered: routes, fuel, timing, delivery confirmations. He signed the paperwork at each facility without reading it, took his copies, and moved on to the next job. The 3rd pickup was delayed. He waited in the van outside the processing hub for 20 minutes, engine idling, until a supervisor finally came out and told him there had been a mix-up with the paperwork and he should come back tomorrow. Callum nodded and pulled away, but the lost time meant he hit traffic on the way back and arrived home later than usual, tired and irritable and wanting nothing more than to eat dinner and go to bed. Owen was already at the table when he came in, picking at a plate of pasta with his phone propped against a water glass. Elaine stood at the counter slicing bread, her movements precise and controlled. She glanced up as Callum entered but said nothing. "Work okay?" Owen asked without looking up from his screen. "Fine," Callum said. He hung his jacket and sat down, pulling the plate Elaine put in front of him closer. The pasta was overcooked and the sauce was thin, but he ate it anyway, chewing methodically, keeping his eyes on the food. Owen flicked his thumb across the screen, then slowed, reading. "Kyle's mum's been taken in," he said. "She's pregnant again." Callum kept eating. "That's what happens, isn't it?" Owen went on. "They take you in if it's a second and you have to stay there till it's done. Then they don't let you keep it. Everyone knows that. Kyle says his aunt had one a couple of years back and they took it straight off her. Didn't even bring it home. He shrugged, still scrolling. Says she's never been right since. Just sits there. Doesn't talk much. His mum's always going on about it, like it's some kind of warning. He glanced up briefly. Don't know why people risk it. It's not like you get a choice once they find out. Elaine sat very still, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond the table. Owen dropped his eyes back to the screen. Anyway, they've taken her in now. Kyle says they don't tell you anything while you're there. Just keep you till it's over, then that's it. Callum kept eating, slow and steady, as if nothing in the room had changed. That's enough, Elaine said quietly. Owen looked up, surprised. What? I'm just saying what Kyle told me. It's not like it's a secret. Everyone knows how it works. I said that's enough. Owen shrugged and went back to his phone, scooping pasta into his mouth with one hand while he scrolled with the other. Callum finished his meal in silence and carried his plate to the sink, standing there longer than necessary while he rinsed it under the tap. When he turned around, Elaine was staring at him with an expression he could not read. Later, after Owen had gone upstairs and the house had settled into its evening quiet, Callum found Elaine in the living room sitting on the sofa with her hands folded in her lap. She was not reading or watching television or doing any of the small tasks she usually occupied herself with. She was simply sitting, staring at the wall opposite. He sat down beside her and waited. Outside, a car drove past, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling before fading into darkness. I have to call in sick tomorrow, Elaine said eventually. Her voice was flat, drained of inflection. I can't keep going in like this. I threw up twice during my shift yesterday and Angela noticed. She didn't say anything but she noticed. I could see it. Callum thought about Angela, Elaine's supervisor at the textile factory where she worked quality control. Angela was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and efficient, the sort of woman who missed nothing and reported everything. How long can you call in sick before they start asking questions? He asked. A week, maybe 2 if I get a doctor's note. After that they'll want me to come in for an assessment. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. And I can't do that. You know I can't. He did know. An assessment would mean medical checks, questions about symptoms, records that would be filed and cross-referenced. It would mean exposure, discovery, the machinery of the regime turning its attention toward them. And once that happened, there would be no hiding it. You'll have to quit, he said. Elaine closed her eyes. If I quit, we lose my income. We can't afford this place on just your salary. We're barely managing as it is. It was true. His work paid well enough for a single-income family, but not well enough for comfort. They had no savings to speak of, no cushion to fall back on. Losing Elaine's wages would mean cutting back on everything, rationing food, falling behind on bills. It would mean drawing attention to themselves in a different way, the kind of attention that came when people started struggling and asking for help. I'll pick up extra runs, Callum said. I'll tell them I'm available for overflow work. There's always extra if you're willing to take it. And what happens in 3 months? 4. When I start showing properly and we can't hide it anymore? What happens when Owen notices, or the neighbors, or someone from your work sees me and puts it together? Callum had no answer for that. He had been avoiding thinking about it, pushing it away every time it tried to surface, but now it sat between them like a physical thing, impossible to ignore. We could leave, Elaine said quietly. Go somewhere else. Somewhere rural where they don't check as carefully. I've heard there are places. There are no places, Callum interrupted. Everywhere has checkpoints now. Everywhere has registration requirements. Even if we could get past the travel restrictions, we'd be flagged as missing within a week and then we'd be fugitives on top of everything else. So what, then? We just wait until someone notices and they take me away. Take our baby and give it to someone else while we go back to pretending everything's normal? Her voice had risen slightly, sharp with frustration and fear. Callum glanced toward the ceiling, listening for sounds of movement from Owen's room, but there was nothing. I don't know, he said finally. It was the truth, and it felt like failure to admit it. I don't know what we do. Elaine stood abruptly and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to look out at the darkened street. You see them every day, she said without turning around. The women you transport. You know what happens to them. You know what the facilities are like. He did. He knew exactly what they were like, the sterile corridors and locked doors, the intake rooms where women were processed and catalogued, the secure wings where they were kept until delivery. He knew about the assessments and the arbitrary standards, the way decisions were made behind closed doors by people who cared nothing for the women involved. He knew because he was part of it, because his work enabled it, because he had chosen a long time ago that it was easier not to ask questions he did not want answered. It won't come to that, he said, though he did not believe it. Elaine let the curtain fall and turned back to him. You can't promise that. You know you can't. She was right, of course. He could not promise anything. The regime had rules, and the rules were absolute, and they applied to everyone regardless of whether you spent your days helping to enforce them or not. Perhaps especially if you did. I'll figure something out, he said. I'll talk to people. There might be options we haven't thought of. What people? What options? He did not answer because he did not have names to give her or ideas that sounded remotely plausible. He just needed her to believe for a little longer that there was a solution, that he could fix this, that his years of careful compliance and deliberate blindness might count for something when it mattered. Elaine came back to the sofa and sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. She leaned her head against him and he put his arm around her, holding her carefully as if she might break. I'm scared, she whispered. I know. What are we going to do? I don't know, he said again. But we'll think of something. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but it was all he had to offer. So they sat together in the darkened room, holding on to each other while the night deepened around them and the future they had not planned for drew steadily closer. Callum's phone woke him at 5 in the morning with a message from dispatch. Emergency run, double pay, pick up at 6 from the central processing hub. He looked across at Elaine. She was still asleep, curled on her side with one hand tucked under her pillow. In the dim light from the phone she looked younger than she was, vulnerable in a way that made his chest tighten. He dressed quietly and went downstairs, to make coffee strong enough to cut through the fog in his head. The emergency runs were usually the difficult ones, the pickups that had complications or required discretion beyond the usual don't ask don't tell arrangement. But they paid well, and after last night's conversation about money and Elaine quitting her job, he could not afford to turn it down. The processing hub was nearly empty when he arrived, just a skeleton crew on the overnight shift. The supervisor who met him at the loading bay was someone he'd not seen before, a thin man in his 40s with a clipboard and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was new to the role. Your rig? The man asked, though he had clearly already checked Callum's identification against whatever was on his clipboard. That's right. Good. This one needs to go to Fernwood facility. Intake's expecting her by 8. There's been a delay with the paperwork, but it's all sorted now. Just needs to be moved quickly and quietly. You understand? Callum understood. Quickly and quietly meant someone had made a mistake somewhere in the system and they were trying to fix it before it became an official problem. It meant the woman in question had probably been sitting in a holding cell longer than she should have been, that people were nervous about audits and documentation trails, that everyone involved wanted this resolved without fuss. No problem, Callum said. The supervisor looked relieved. Right then. She's just through here. He followed the man through a side door into a narrow corridor lit by flickering fluorescent tubes. The walls, painted institutional green, were scuffed and stained with partially removed graffiti. At the end of the corridor was a reinforced door with a small window set at head height. The supervisor unlocked it and pushed it open. The woman inside was sitting on a metal bench bolted to the wall. She looked up as they entered, and Callum felt a twinge in his chest. She was young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a high ponytail and a bruise flowering across her left cheekbone. Her hands were folded in her lap and she was very still, the kind of stillness that came from being afraid to draw attention. But it was her abdomen that made him stop. She was heavily pregnant, far more obviously so than any of the women he usually transported. 7 months at least, maybe 8. The curve of her belly strained against the thin fabric of the processing center gown they had given her. "On your feet," the supervisor said, not unkindly. "Time to go." The woman stood slowly, one hand braced against the wall for balance. She did not look at Callum directly, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. "This way," the supervisor said, gesturing toward the door. Callum stepped back to let them pass and followed them down the corridor to the loading bay. The van was waiting where he had parked it, rear doors already open. The supervisor helped the woman up into the cargo space with more care than Callum had expected, steadying her elbow as she climbed the step. "You'll want to take the back roads," the supervisor said quietly once the woman was settled. "Avoid the checkpoints on the main route. There's been some trouble with protesters this week and we don't need any delays." Callum nodded. Protesters were rare but not unheard of, usually small groups who gathered outside facilities or processing hubs with signs and slogans until security moved them along. He had seen them a few times over the years, mostly older women who remembered how things used to be. They never achieved anything, but they made the officials nervous, and nervous officials meant extra precautions and complicated routes. He closed the rear doors and locked them, then walked round to the driver's side and climbed in. The supervisor handed him the manifest through the window, a single sheet this time rather than the usual multi-page document. "Fernwood by 8, the supervisor repeated. "No stops." "Understood." Callum pulled out of the loading bay and onto the empty street. Dawn was just beginning to break, painting the sky in shades of grey and pale orange. He took the turn for the back roads as instructed. The roads were narrow and poorly maintained, winding through industrial estates and abandoned warehouses, but they avoided the main checkpoints and the cameras that monitored traffic flow. He had been driving for 20 minutes when he heard a sound from the cargo space, muffled but unmistakable. A cry, sharp and sudden, cut off almost immediately as if she had tried to stifle it. Callum's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He kept driving, eyes fixed on the road ahead. It was not his concern. Whatever was happening in the back was not his responsibility. His job was to deliver the cargo to Fernwood by 8 o'clock, and that was exactly what he would do. Another cry, longer this time. Then silence. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 6:45. Another hour and 15 minutes to Fernwood if traffic stayed clear. He pressed down slightly on the accelerator, increasing speed within the margins that would not draw attention if anyone was watching. The sound came again, and this time it did not stop. It built and peaked and broke into something that sounded like sobbing, ragged and desperate. Callum could hear her moving around in the cargo space, then the thud of something hitting the floor. He should keep driving. He should ignore it. He had ignored worse over the years, had taught himself to disconnect the sounds from their meaning, to focus on the practical details and let everything else fade into background noise. It was a skill he had cultivated carefully because it was necessary for survival, his and his family's. But the woman in the back of his van was pregnant. Heavily pregnant. And something was wrong.